live on Romans 8:28 Publishing. Elder Mike here, ready to bring you another word from God. An honor and a privilege to do so. I want to welcome everybody who is tuning in live. I want to just welcome everybody who will be tuning in at a later date. God bless you all. God bless you all. It is an honor to stand before you. And I just want to welcome you back to our series here on using our power for God's purpose. That's what we're talking about, using your power for God's purpose. Because boy, I tell you the difference that it makes in your life. And I'm not going to say that if you use your power for God's purpose, you're never going to have a problem and everything's going to go smoothly. But there is certainly a difference. There is a grace, there is an elegance to your life when you use your power for God's purpose that is not there. Even in the troubling times, there is a grace to life that exists when you're using your power for God's purpose. And so we've been looking into this. We've already spent 2 weeks on this topic. We're coming from the book of Judges, looking at two very popular judges from that book that God had called on to deliver the Israelites from their enemies. We spent 2 weeks looking at that man Samson. That's right. Big, buff, strong Samson with all the power, with all the strength that God had given him. And yet we see that in Samson, we saw our example of what life looks like when we don't use our power for God's purpose. When God gives us gifts and He gives us an assignment and we don't marry those two things, when we don't match up our gift and use it towards the assignment that God has in our lives, we see that with Samson, that his life, everything was a struggle, that all his motivation was always out of chaos, and it was out of betrayal, and it was out of revenge, and it was out of all these things. He had to be dragged into everything that he needed to do for God, and it just led to a lot of betrayal in his life. It led to a lot of chaos. It led to a lot of just unnecessary stress, a lot of unnecessary agitation. Those things in life that just draw on us, they draw from us, and yet they give us nothing back. And we saw a lot of that in Samson, that he had a life that was just filled with chaos and anger and unnecessary drama. And we also learned another thing from Samson, that if God gives us power and puts an assignment on it, He puts a purpose on it, that purpose is going to be fulfilled. That even if we try running the other way, almost like Jonah, he tried running the other way, but God said, no, my will be done. Well, He did the same thing with Samson. Samson tried not to do what God called him to do, but God just put him in positions over and over again where he was pushed into confronting the enemy that he did not want to confront. But we also learned another important lesson from Samson as well, and that is it's never too late for your greatest victory. Because we see when it looked like when he was down, when it looked like he was out, when he had his eyes plucked out, when he was chained, when he was being mocked, is when he actually had his greatest victory. And that's because when that happened, that's when he finally turned back to God and acknowledged God as the source of all his power. And tonight, we're going to look at the flip side of that coin. We're going to look at Gideon, who really over and over again uses the great gift that God had given him for the assignment that God had put on his life. And we're going to see the difference in his battle. We're going to see the difference in how his battle goes versus how Samson's battles went, and just the smoothness, like I said, there's still a fight, but there's grace in the fight rather than all this drama and unnecessary anxiety and anger and hostility. So we see that's the way it was here, and he walked in obedience as God directed him. And you see, we're going to start off with in Gideon. The story of Gideon begins in Judges chapter 6. We're going to be looking at 6 through 8 as we study Gideon. We're probably only going to get through 6 and then a good portion of 7 tonight. But the book begins like this, and it's very interesting, and I think it's a place that we can find ourselves at often in our lives as well when we talk about the Israelites. Because it says, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years He gave them into the hand of the Midianites. And so we see here what happened. We see that the Israelites had gone astray. They had started commingling with the enemies in the land. They had started worshiping the idols. They had started worshiping the gods of the land, of those people, instead of honoring, instead of worshiping the one and true living God, instead of driving the people out of the land. Here they start intermingling with them. They start taking on their traits and start observing and worshiping their gods, which is something certainly that can happen in our lives. And we see as it goes on in the scriptures, it's like they think that God has left them. And this is the thing, that God never left them and God never leaves us. But the thing is, they were walking away from God. He was walking patiently behind them, following, listening, observing. But he does not turn us around and force us in the turnaround. But we see when they do turn around, when they do call out to him, that he has the answer waiting. And it's the same for us. We may go through a season in our lives when we're chasing after the job, when we're chasing after the money, when we're worried more about our 401k than we're worried about what God has called us to do, when we're worried more about our spouse or our children than we're worried about what God has called us to do, and we're worried about our houses and our cars than we're worried about what God has called us to do. But this is what I love about God, and I can tell you from my own testimony, because it's happened many times. When you just stop, you realize you're following that wrong thing, and you turn around, God is there with the answer. And it was the same thing for the Israelites, because when they finally came to their senses, when they finally called out to God, when they finally said, God, we need you, he had Gideon, already a grown man, already ready to go, had everything lined up just the way they would need it for their deliverance when they turned back to God. And so we see here that he has that answer, and that answer is in Gideon. And so we see that he sends the angel of the Lord. He sends an angel down to Gideon to let Gideon know, here's what your assignment is. Here is what I have called you to do. And this is where we're going to start to see Gideon's, what his superpower is. We're going to see what his assignment is, and then we're going to observe from here on how he uses that gift, how he uses that power for what God has called him to do. Because if you go to Judges chapter 6, verse 14, it says, the Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? And I really pay a lot of attention to the words that God chooses whenever God speaks. And I love the specificity and I love the clarity that he gives us in this very simple statement, something that can be easily missed though if you're not seeking the Spirit of God to reveal it to you. He says, go in the strength you have. And this is what I love about God. He doesn't call us to go in the strength that someone else has. He doesn't tell us to go with someone else's giftings. He doesn't tell us to go and do somebody else's assignment. But he says, go in the strength you have and do what I have called you to do. So God is not calling you to be more than what he gave you to provide. So this is why we need to, again, seek God's face, seek God's will, listen to God for what our assignment is, because otherwise we're going into an assignment that's not ours, trying to use a gift that is not lined up to meet that assignment, that is not designed to bring us victory in that battle. So make sure that you seek God and make sure that you're lining up again that gift that he gave you with the assignment that he has placed on your life. Because here we see his assignment, and it is a huge assignment, is to save Israel out of Midian's hand. And that is no small task. And yet Gideon can do it in the power. So he's saying, I have already given you all the strength you need. And whatever it is, when God gives you an assignment, keep that in mind. Go in your power. Whatever strength you have, that is enough strength that God has given you for the task that you have at hand. And it doesn't take us long. God has just given them the assignment, and we're going to see exactly what Gideon's superpower is, what his power is, what his gifting is that is going to lead him into the victory if he will just use that power for God's purpose. Because we see here in verse 15, we see Gideon's response to God, and it reveals to us what his superpower is. Because he responds by saying, "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." And this is the thing, is we don't often think of of this power being a power one you would give to a warrior, a leader of an army, because his superpower is humility. His superpower is a humble nature. His superpower is that he doesn't think that he by his own might can do it. He goes so far as to say, look, if you take the least clan, and then you take the smallest family in that clan, and then you take the least member of that family, that's who I am. Of all the people in Manasseh, saying, I am the least of those that would be capable of this task. And the reason why this is such a superpower is because when you marry it with that purpose, when you do it, he realizes he can't do it on his own. You see, Samson had this physical strength, he had this might, he had this fighting prowess that led him to believe he could do it on his own, which led him to forget that God was the one that gave it to him, and God could take it away. But here we have Gideon. His superpower is humility. So he knows going in, I can't do anything unless God gives me the ability to do it. And then I love this too, because we see here, the thing is, Gideon hasn't realized who it is that he's speaking to yet. He doesn't realize just who it is that's standing before him. And yet, just thinking this is just a messenger that has brought him a word, I love this is, again, the humility that he says, before you go, if I have found favor in your eyes, it's your decision. I'm not forcing it on you. But if I have found favor in your eyes, please let me prepare a sacrifice for you. Let me deliver a sacrifice to you to honor you, even though I don't know that you're the angel of the Lord yet. And so he goes and he gets the sacrifice, and he brings it and he puts it on the altar, and the angel of the Lord touches the tip of his staff to the rock, and flames come up out of the rock and consume the sacrifice. And we see here, again, that now this is the first time we see by his reaction that Gideon, when this happens, is just realizing who it is that he's talking to. And regardless of who he was talking to, he still showed that same reverence and that same respect that he would had he known that it was the angel of the Lord that was standing there before him. That's the humility. I'm going to treat you the same regardless of whether you can do something for me, whether I think you got power, whether I think you're the angel of the Lord, or whether I think you might be trying to backstab me. I'm still going to be the gracious host to you. I'm still going to honor you. I'm still going to respect you. I'm still going to treat you right regardless of who you are. I'm not going to think, oh, you're just this or you're just that and I'm better than you. No, he says, you know what? Let me honor you before he even knew it was the angel of the Lord that he was speaking to. And then the Lord, as he does, he jumps right into getting Gideon into the assignment, because the idea is to drive out the Midianites, and he knows that for that there needs to be a confrontation. He knows that for that Gideon has to be set apart, that he can't be living like the rest of the Israelites. And so he gives Gideon an assignment. And here's where we really we're going to see here the difference between humility and low self-esteem. Or as I would like to say it, this is where we're going to see the difference between meekness and weakness. Because see, this is the thing. Low self-esteem is going to tell you, I can't do it. And this is, I want to make sure, because I've seen sometimes, I think people mistake that this meekness that the scriptures talk about for weakness, because weakness is saying, I can't do it. Meekness is saying, I can do it in God's strength. Humility is saying, I can do it in God's strength. That not by my might I can do it, but by the might of God at my back, I know that I can do it. Because what God does here is God puts him in a position where he's got to, before he sends him into the big battle, he says, I'm going to give you a little battle for a warm-up. And God will do that. God will prepare us beforehand. He'll make sure that he builds us up to where we need to be and not throw us in before we're prepared. So he tells Gideon, he says, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go, see that altar to Baal up there? I want you to take that, I want you to destroy it. I want you to rip it down, and I want you to build a proper altar to make your sacrifice to me, the Lord of the heavens and the Lord of the earth. And then you see that Asherah pole over there. You see that Asherah pole that the Israelites are bowing down to, that they're worshiping at, that has nothing to do with me. I want you to take that. I want you to cut that up, and I want you to use that as the wood for the sacrifice. And this is the thing. All the people in Manasseh were bowing down and using these altars. So Gideon knows going into it that he is going to be tried. He is going to be tested. That there is going to be backlash on him and his family if he does this. So what does he do though? He's not weak. He doesn't run from the fight. He doesn't disobey God and what God told him to do. But because he is meek, he uses his wisdom, he uses the revelation of God, and he does it at night instead, so that he's not deceived. Think about Samson. Samson, with his big bad boldness, probably would have gone and done it in the middle of the day, and instead of now going out and fighting the Midianites, he would have been fighting the Israelites, the people that he was supposed to be delivering. So just use that humility. Amen. See, Gideon didn't have that super strength, that fighting ability. So he knows if they come and try and kill me for breaking down their altar, yeah, I know that I'm not going to be able to fight them off. I don't have enough authority in this land that I've got authority to get out of this. So he knows, you know what, I got to use some wisdom, and he goes out at night, but he still does it. Even so, and it shows that see, this is how you know that the prophet is right, because it comes to pass. Because as it comes to pass, and when the people do find out Gideon did it, they're telling his father, send them out so we can kill them. These people that he has been sent to deliver, these people that were a part of his family, are saying, send them out so that we can kill them. And we see that's exactly what Gideon thought would happen, and it's exactly what happened. But you know what God did? Gideon's heavenly father, sent his natural father to speak to the people. And his father said, no, this is my child. You're not touching my child. Just like God does with us. You're not touching my child. He says, you know what? If Baal is so big and bad, then you know what? Let him stand up and defend himself. And that shut the people up and sent them packing so that Gideon could get to the work that God had for him. This is where, again, we're talking about humility here. We're not talking about weakness. We're talking about humility. We're talking about, I can do it, but it's got to be in God's power. And so now that this has passed, he's passed his first test. He's built a little bit of confidence. He's built a little strength. He sees that God protected him when he went and did this thing that he thought could cost him his life. So now is when it really starts to get serious, though, because if we look down at Judges chapter 6 at verse 33, it says, now all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, so that they went up to meet them. So we see here what happens in that now what happens? He has passed this first little test. Okay, so now you're ready. So now God releases the Amorites. He releases the Amalekites and the people of the east to come into the land, because now Gideon is ready to defeat them. And this is what we see is as they come into the land, and this is where we see the beginning of the divergence between Gideon and Samson. As we see here, I love this, it says, then the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon, and he blew a trumpet summoning. So as soon as the Spirit of the Lord moved on Gideon, Gideon moved on the assignment that God had given him. So when God's Spirit starts to move in you, immediately move on the assignment that God has given you. If you remember Samson, very different story, right? Because Samson, what happened with Samson? Samson, it says at the end of chapter 13, the last verse of chapter 13 says that the Spirit of God was moving on Samson. And what does the first couple verses of chapter 14 say? Samson, after the Spirit of God moved on him, he was in a Philistine town, asking his mother to get him a Philistine wife, right? Doing exactly the opposite. So here the Spirit of God started moving on Samson, and he was still being controlled by his flesh. Here we see that immediately when it says the Spirit of God began to move on Gideon, that Gideon began to move on the plan, that he started to assemble the army that he would need in order to accomplish God's plan. Right away, no hesitation, no delay. That's the humility, that's the meekness of knowing I need to do it God's way, or it is not going to get done. And that's where we see here. And we're going to see here, just before we get into how Gideon's battle is going to lay out. We're going to take a quick recap, so it'll be fresh in your mind when we get to Gideon's story, how Samson's greatest battles went. Right, Samson had a battle that resulted in him slaying 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. A great feat, but we see at the end of that, he is so exhausted, he is so tired that he says he's ready to die. He says, now you've given me this great victory. Now am I going to just die of thirst in this land and be left to these uncircumcised Philistines, right? So we see the draining, we see the toll that the battle took on him. And then for his greatest victory, what happened? He had to have his eyes plucked out, he had to be in chains. So there's this drama, there's this exhaustion, there's this draining that we see in Samson's battles. Why? Because when the Spirit of God moved on him, he didn't move on God's assignment. Now we see that Gideon, again, right away, the Spirit moved on him. He is moving on God's assignment. And so we're going to take a look at how his battle goes compared to what I just described in Samson's battles. Because it says here, it goes on to say, and I love this from Gideon, because here's his response. After he's blown the horn, he's assembling his army, and he says, Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised. And I love, and then he goes to consult with God. But he starts it with, if you will save Israel by my hand. Yes, it's going to be my hands doing the work. Yes, it's going to be my body that people see leading the way. But I know that it is by your power. I know it's because you go before me. So we see this mentality in Gideon that's so different from Samson's. And he seeks some consultation from God. He seeks a confirmation from God, and he asks God to do a couple things, just so that I know, so that I can go with the confidence knowing that you're leading me. And he puts down a wool fleece on the ground. He says, I'll tell you what, if you just wet this fleece and the ground around it is dry, then I'll know that you are sending me. And so God does. He wakes up the next day and he wrings out that fleece, and he can get buckets of water out of that fleece, but the ground around it is completely dry. Clearly, God had moved that night. And then the next day he says, okay, now let's try it this way, God, just to make sure that there wasn't some law of physics I don't understand. Can you do me a favor now, God? Can you make the ground around it wet and the fleece dry? And the next morning when he woke up, guess what? That's right. The fleece was dry and all the ground around it was wet. And now he knew that he knew that he knew. God, see how God is providing him. God is guiding him step by step. He gives him a little test. He passed the test. He says, now can you just give me some confirmation, God? And God has now given him the confirmation. And now Gideon feels that he's ready to go forth and prepare and get into the battle. And so we see now the battle is going to begin in chapter 7. So we're moving on from chapter 6 to chapter 7 now, and it says that early in the morning, that here he has amassed his army, and he's in one place, and the enemy is not far away, but God knows, right? God knows, okay, you know what? He still is not quite there, and this is what I love, is God provides us whatever we need, because they're camped at the spring of Harod, and God comes to him and he says, you know what? You have too many men. And I love this because God's going to make it clear nobody but me could do it. So Gideon originally had assembled 32,000 men. And God has said, you know what? That's too many. We want to make sure that everybody knows it's me that's getting this victory. And so God says, you know what? You tell anybody who's scared, anybody who's worried they might flee if the battle turns rough, I want you to send them home. And guess what? Out of 32,000, 22,000 of them leave, so there's only 10,000 left. So more than 2/3 of the army leave because they're afraid of the battle. And God has left. He said, you know what? 10,000, that's still a few too many. I don't think we quite need 10,000 and keep in mind, they're fighting against not an army, they're fighting against armies. Multiple nations have come together with their armies. So they're fighting a formidable force. And God says, you know what? 10,000 is still too many. I want you to go down to the water, and anybody who kneels down and drinks directly from the water, you send them home. And anybody who cups it and laps the water like a dog from their hands, I want you to keep them. And guess how many that left them with? I know I got some Bible scholars out there, you probably know, 300 people. So now we have Gideon and an army of 300 going up against the armies of multiple nations that have taken over the land. Can't even count the camels that they have with them because there's so many people there. And this is what God is going to do. Because we see that whenever we use our power for God's purpose, God is going to make sure that we have what we need. And God knew that Gideon needed one more thing before he went into the battle. So God gives him that one more thing. And God says, you know what? If you want to make sure, if you want to be sure that you're sure that you're sure that I'm going into this battle ahead of you, I want you to go down into the camp and just listen to what the people are saying. And just as they get to the edge of the camp, he hears two Midianite soldiers talking, and one says to the other, you know, I had this weird dream that a barley loaf came rolling into the camp, and that barley loaf hit a tent, the whole tent collapsed, created a shambles, it was a mess, and then they start interpreting that dream, and one of the soldiers says, you know what that means? That means that the hand of Gideon, that's the sword of Gideon, coming to slay us, coming to defeat us. And so Gideon now, God has given him the last thing that he needs. He has heard it from the soldier's mouth, so to speak. He has heard it from their mouth that there is a fear among him. There is a fear of him among the people in the army. And so now Gideon, first thing he does is he worships God. He acknowledges, as it was so important for us to do, that it's by God's power. God has given them into his hand with faith and with confidence. He worships God not after the battle, not during the battle, but before he even gets to the battle. And that's what we need to do as well. We need to as we walk into the assignment that God has for him, worship him before we get to it. Praise him before we get to it. Pray, because you can't praise him all the way through unless you praise him before you even start. So we see that the first thing he does, he says, you know what, God? I got faith in you. I know you did it. And I'm going to worship you the way that you have called me to, because I know that you are the one that's going to deliver me. And then, of course, they go and they're getting into the battle. And I love the way that God does it, because of course, it's a very traditional battle plan that God has for him. God comes up with some different ways of doing things. So if the way that God has given you to take on that battle, if the way that God has given you to fight that fight, and you look at it and you go, that just doesn't even make sense. Remember Jericho? March around it 7 times, march around for 7 days, then on the 7th day, march around 7 times, blow a horn, and the walls are going to fall down, and you're going to storm that. No, it doesn't make sense. And because God makes it clear, he's the only one that could do things the way that these things get done. So we look at, if we begin at verse 19 of chapter 7, it's going to tell us this battle plan that God has given them. Again, if the battle plan that you have, if the battle plan God has given you doesn't seem to make sense by your standards, you know what? That's a pretty good indicator that it's probably the battle plan that God has given you. Because if we begin at 19, it says, Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch. Just after they had changed the guard, they blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. Grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets that they were to blow, they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran crying out as they fled. And so this is the thing, right? Of course, how else would you fight a battle? How else would you defeat an enemy except to hold up torches, break a jar, and shout and blow trumpets? And that's the way to defeat an army, right? Now, when it's God, it's not always going to make sense. So don't be afraid to step out if it doesn't make sense. Be all the more encouraged to do it. And we see here, what's the end result? Remember, we're looking at here how walking in obedience to God, how using our power for God's purpose, how marrying our gifts with our assignments affects how the battle goes, how it affects the grace and the dignity that we have in our lives, even when we've got a battle to take. And remember, we talked about Samson's battles, how there was always drama, how there was always chaos, how there was always a struggle, how at the end of the battle he was drained, he was worried he was even going to die, he was so thirsty. At the end of another one, he dies with the very enemy that he's fighting at the end of his greatest victory. And that's what happens when we don't marry our power to God's purpose. Now, let's look at how Gideon's battle goes, because we see from the very beginning, by Gideon's humility, he has walked every step of the way, trusting in God. And how does his battle go? When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. So here we have the enemy now fighting themselves. That there isn't this draining effect on Gideon. There isn't this draining effect on his army, but yet the Lord is fighting before them. The Lord is defeating the enemy, so there isn't the stress and the strain on them to get the victory. The Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. So they're fighting against each other now. The army fled to Beth Shittah towards Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Maholah near Tabbath. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. So when we compare these battles, we see that Samson, who did not use his power for God's purpose, and Gideon, who did. We see the drama and the drain in Samson's life, following his own way, trusting in his own power, trusting in his own physical strength to get the victory. We see this drain, we see this drama, we see this chaos, we see this, and drama, there's very few things worse in your life than drama and stress. They've got this tendency to just draw on you, to take from you, and never give anything back. But when we go forth in the peace of God in that battle, knowing that it's already won, going obediently, knowing that as long as we're walking his path, he is going to bring us through. We see that there is a peace that we come out the other side stronger. We come out the other side better. We come out the other side with more faith, ready for a bigger and a greater battle, and not drained and worry about dying and ended up in the enemy's hands even after we've already had a great victory. So one thing that I want to make sure that I don't do here, though, because I never want to mislead anybody in anything, and that's why we're going to have a second lesson on Gideon here. Because the one thing that I do want to make sure that you understand as well, though, is that peace and that grace and that strength and that building up that we get after we come out of the battle does not mean that the battle is going to be without a struggle. It doesn't mean that the battle is going to be without a fight. It doesn't mean that the enemy is literally going to defeat themselves and there's not going to be anything, effort that we have to put into it, that there's not going to be any struggle in it. So we looked at the beginning of this here, where the grace and the beauty of using his power for God's purpose has led to a victory that has started very smoothly, but we are going to see, so I want you to tune in, very important to get the full message here, to tune in next week, because we're going to see what does Gideon do when the troubles start, right? Because sometimes when everything's going smoothly, when everything's going, it's easy to walk that path in God's way. It's easier to walk that path in God's will when you're having victory after victory, when the enemy's defeating themselves. But tune back in next week, because next week we're going to look at what happens when things start going sideways. Does Gideon change his character? Does Gideon say, well, this shouldn't be happening. God must not be with me right now. Maybe I ought to change tactics and rely on my own way. No, we're going to see next week that Gideon, even as some troubles, even as some struggles, even as some enemies among his friends start to rise up against him, we're going to see he keeps that same humble power that God has given him to navigate through the troubles, to navigate through the trials of the battle, and that it leads to a great victory that, again, doesn't deplete, but it restores through the battle. So I just want to encourage you this. Just remember to use your power for God's purpose. And I'm telling you, I think there's a reason God has me teaching this right now, because I'm looking at some things in my life that I've been trying to do by my own strength. I see some assignments that God has given me, and I haven't been using his gifts toward them. So I'm teaching this to myself as I go through it. And next week is going to be a very important lesson because we're not prosperity preachers here. I'm not going to tell you, Jesus had to bear a cross. Jesus said that the Son of Man has no place to rest his head. Jesus did not have it. Jesus came to serve and not to be served. So certainly nothing Jesus has ever said has indicated that we've got this unlimited prosperity, this struggle-free life. So I want you to tune in next week so that you don't leave this thinking, okay, if I just do this, my enemies are going to defeat themselves. There's still going to be some struggles, but we're going to look next week when the struggles arise, when you've been walking according to God's will. It doesn't mean trouble's not going to come up. But now that we've been walking in God's will, how do we stay in God's will? How do we navigate the troubles that come in the battle while still walking in the power, while still using the gifts that God has given us? So I pray that this has been a blessing to you. I hope that you will tune in next week for the conclusion of this lesson as we see the great glory, we see the grace in our lives, we see the peace and the joy in our lives that comes from using our power for God's purpose. God bless you all and have a blessed evening.